Hello non-fiction fans, may I have the next dance? Here's 19 reasons to read Danse Macabre. Hi everyone, I'm Dave Musson at Dave Musson on Instagram, and welcome back to my channel where I'm going through every single book by Stephen King in chronological order and giving you 19 reasons to read each one. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in more of, feel free to check the other videos on my channel, and also maybe consider subscribing so you don't miss any future videos too. Okay, we're now up to 1981, a year which featured something different for King, his first non-fiction book. That book was called Danse Macabre, and that is the subject of this video. So, without further ado, here are 19 reasons to read this. So, here's what's fucking cool about this book. It is a deep dive on the horror genre written by the master of horror himself. Our man takes a look at horror fiction, horror radio, horror TV, and horror movies. It genuinely is a fascinating read. Now, all that might sound like a bit of a heavy read compared to just checking out a novel, for instance, but fear not. Our man King had those same fears himself, and he said his biggest desire with this book was to, and I quote, avoid academic bullshit. Which he did. The result is that it's much more like just sitting down with King himself and having him talk horror with you. It's great. So this wasn't King's idea originally. He actually credits his former editor Bill Thompson with coming up with the concept. King himself said the concept intrigued and frightened him at the same time. So I think the timing of this book is a pretty interesting reason to check it out too. Think about when it came out in King's career. Obviously he was successful. He'd just come off that run of Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, The Stand, The Dead Zone and Firestarter. He was on the bestsellers list, but he was still just before the tipping point where he really just flooded the mainstream. So it still feels like he's almost got a bit of a point to prove, and this is him trying to do that in a slightly different format. And what comes across most is just his passion for the genre. That kind of thing from this kind of writer is always going to be worth checking out. Now, if you're wondering why I'm doing this book now and not grouping it in with the other books that came out in 1983, which is when the paperback of Danse Macabre came out, well, let me explain. It was first published, as I said at the start of the video, in 1981 in a very limited edition hardback. How limited? Well, 250 numbered copies and 15 lettered copies, and that was it. Imagine how fucking expensive those would be on eBay today. Whew. So in that first edition, King did ask for readers to let him know of any mistakes they spotted, and of course they did, and he incorporated those corrections in the 1983 paperback edition. Now, if only he'd had social media back in 1981, hey? Everyone would have told him absolutely everything that was wrong with it, and everything they disagreed with, and reasons why they hated him, all without him asking for it. While we're talking different editions, Danse Macabre was reissued in 2010 with another new intro from King. This one was called What's Scary? What's scary? Your fucking books are scary, dude. So King hasn't written an autobiography, or at least not yet, but there are plenty of interesting autobiographical tidbits within Danse Macabre that are well worth reading. For example, if you want to know why the Russian satellite Sputnik could actually be one of the biggest influences on the career of the Master of Horror, then read Danse Macabre. Now, despite wanting to avoid that academic bullshit, King's arguments still come across as really well thought out and really well articulated. My favourite is his examination of the archetype of the horror monster, which King says basically always comes down to one of either the vampire, the werewolf, or the thing without a name. Pretty fucking cool trio, that. And also, I think the vampire, the werewolf, and the thing without a name would make a cool album name, but that might just be me. You can tell King was having fun with this book. You know all that autobiographical stuff I mentioned earlier? Well, when he clusters it together in the middle of Danse Macabre, he calls that chapter an annoying autobiographical pause. And I love it. It just acknowledges that he realises that you might not give a fuck about what he's about to write about himself there, but he's the writer, and fuck you, he's going to do it anyway. A little bit like when you guys comment on my videos to say how much you hate the music. Deal with it. So perhaps the only really dated part of this book from 1981 after all is the section on horror fiction on the radio. And even that's really interesting to read now, particularly in the podcast heavy world that we live in today. There's plenty of inspiration in that chapter for some really spooky audio to be had. On that note, can we take a moment to shout out the fact that a book written 40 years ago is still basically entirely relevant today? Stephen King, what a fucking master. So there's a section on horror TV shows which I guess could be classed as a little dated, mainly because of how much TV has changed. But even then, I find it really fascinating to hear King talking about some of the things that influenced him. You might not know the shows, but you can still get a lot from what he's saying about them. So in the book, King includes 2 chapters on horror movies, which will leave you with a very long list of horror movies that you want to watch afterwards. Thank you, Mr. King. Talking lists, King also goes deep on 10 horror novels, looking at their impact on the genre and their legacy. Again, you will want to read them all afterwards. RIP your TBR lists. So my favourite takeaway of this book is King's 3-tiered definition of horror, and each tier gets more and more horrific. The lowest tier is revulsion. That's the gut stuff, the cheap thrills. Then we're on to horror. That's the moment where you've seen the monster and it's all revealed. But the bit King calls the finest element of horror is terror. That's the bit just before you see the monster, when your heart is pounding against your chest to be let out. King says it's what he aims for in his work, and well, I think we can agree, he's pretty good at it. So the final chapter looks at horror and its potential influence on real life violence. Now obviously this book was written long before King had to face up to the fact of there being school shootings who cited rage as an influence, and obviously there's just been 40 more years of general fucked upness to add since this book came out. So I imagine King's take on all of this would be very different if he rewrote this chapter today. Talking of King's thoughts today, I don't know about you, but I would love to see King write a version 2 of Danse Macabre. He's obviously learnt so much more since the last book, he's got a load more to say, and crucially, he's also at that age where he just doesn't give a shit who he offends anymore, so it'd be really nice to see him pick this up again with the shackles off and his sleeves rolled up. Bring it on, Uncle Stevie. Lastly, if you pick up a physical copy of this book, you may have to make a choice between the aesthetics on your bookshelf and the practicalities of reading it. So if you pick up a vintage copy, like I've got here, you get a choice of some fucking incredible covers. I mean, look at that one. There are some really great ones out there. But the trade-off with the vintage version of this book is often that it's a teeny tiny font that's really difficult to read. Obviously, if you go for a more modern edition, you get a much more legible font, but perhaps a slightly less cool cover. So the choice is down to you. Or you could just get both. Yeah, just get both. So there you go, 19 reasons to read Danse Macabre by Stephen King, his first non-fiction book. We'll be returning to King's take on non-fiction a little later down the line when we get to on writing, but for now we will be treading back fully into the fiction world. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos about Stephen King's books, and do let me know in the comments what you think of Danse Macabre. Or drop me a comment to let me know how much you hate the background music, and yet again I'll have to come up with a nice way of politely telling you to jog on. If you happen to not hate the background music, then you can find a link to the full song on Spotify in the description below. It's written by my band and it's a song about Stephen King. You can also find me on Instagram where I'm at Dave Musson. I run a Stephen King quiz most weeks. Why not come and join one of those and see what your King knowledge is like? Anyway, thanks for getting this far. Next up, a book with real bite that King doesn't even remember writing. See you then.